We all know someone named Scott. It's a very basic name. If your name is Scott, you're likely to fly under the radar because your chances of getting famous are very small. Go ahead, spend the next 10 seconds trying to think of 5 famous people named Scott. I'm serious, I'll time it. I'll put up a timer. Who did you get? That's right, no one who's actually famous. Maybe some B-list people or a couple of athletes. Did you happen to come up with any of the NASCAR drivers that have been named Scott? Scott Riggs, Scott Wimmer, Scott Pruett, and Scott Speed? If you didn't think of any of them, there's a very good reason for that. None of them ever did anything to make them memorable. Because being a NASCAR driver named Scott, it's like the curse of the Bambino. If you're named Scott, your Cup Series career is kind of like the San Diego Padres. Sure, you're there, but most people forget that you even exist. It's time to figure out why Scott sucks. In 1971, 30,875 of American boys born were named Scott. That means that today they'd be 49 years old. That kind of fits well in this discussion because a lot of the NASCAR drivers that have been named Scott were born around that time. It's also just like a really pointless statistic that I'm really proud of looking up and finding. It really doesn't add anything to this, but look, I did research. But why are we only looking at Scott? Why not Jeff or Mike? Lots of NASCAR drivers have been named Mike and never won anything. But Scotts are on a whole other level. No driver named Scott has ever won a Cup race or won a championship at any level. In fact, a driver named Scott has never finished higher than 20th in the Cup Series standings. To make things easier, we're really only going to focus on drivers that made it to Cup and attempted at least one full season. What we're going to see is that each one of these Scotts had a fruitful career before they stepped foot in a Cup car, but then fell into a bottomless pit of misery. And who doesn't love other people's misery? Scott Pruett came to NASCAR after a long career in sports cars and IndyCar. He won an IMSA GTO championship and a Trans Am championship in the 1980s, and then jumped to open wheel. He spent 10 seasons in kart, winning 2 races in that period, finishing in the top 10 in points 6 times. In 2000, his kart team owner Cal Wells brought him over to NASCAR. Pruett would make a run for Cup Series Rookie of the Year in 2000, but had a, not so great year. In fact, it was dismal. He had just 1 top 10 and failed to qualify 6 times. This effectively ended Pruett's career as a full-time NASCAR driver. He would, however, spend the next 8 seasons serving as a road course ringer for Chip Ganassi Racing, earning multiple top 5s at Sonoma and Watkins Glen. Oh, and he also wound up winning 8 million Grand Am races and 47,000 titles. So Scott Pruett has a very small sample size, the smallest of anyone we'll look at. But he had a successful career in motorsport, went to NASCAR, was awful, and then essentially ran back to sports cars and was successful again. So this is now our second piece of evidence that Scotts do not belong in the Cup Series.
Guess what? ARCA qualifying was rained out, so he could not start the race. He moved his car over to the NASCAR Winston Cup garage. He made the race, and guess who's leading the race right now?
How about that?
Scott Wimmer came here to run the ARCA race, and 57 laps into it is leading the Napa 500.
Scott Wimmer was a light that shone bright through the darkness in the early 2000s. You could see his talent from a mile away. He burst on the scene in 2000 when he led in his Cup debut, driving a car that was supposed to be in the ARCA race that weekend. The kid looked unstoppable. In 3 Xfinity Series seasons with Bill Davis Racing, he racked up 5 wins and 37 top 10s, nearly winning the championship in 2002. He did all of this driving unsponsored cars for a team owner that fielded whatever manufacturer he wanted. At the end of the 2003 season, Wimmer took over Bill Davis Racing's Cup car and earned a top 10 right away along with several strong runs. In 2004, he was a full-time Cup driver and immediately earned a top 5 finish in the Daytona 500. Wimmer then began to fall victim to the curse of Scott. He had just 1 other top 10 that year and finished 27th in points. But maybe the curse is just a myth, right? Maybe his sophomore season will be better. In 2005, he had no top 10s, an average finish of 26th, and finished 32nd in points. He also found out that the team had fired him via snail mail. In 2006, Scott had another terrible Cup Series year, this time driving for Morgan McClure Motorsports. He had no top 10s, several DNQs, and was released by the team late in the season. Scott then returned to the Xfinity Series in 2007, and look at that, he was successful, because Scotts are allowed to have success in Xfinity. He ran partial schedules through 2011, earning his final win at Nashville in 2008. So in Scott Wimmer's 111-race Cup career, he earned 3 top 10s. Add that to Scott Pruett's stats, and we're at 151 races and 9 top 10s, so about a top 10 every 15 races. 2 per season. Terrible. There was another Cup rookie named Scott in 2004, Scott Riggs. He came up through the NASCAR ladder in the early 2000s. He started out in the Truck Series, winning 5 races in 2001, and then moved up to the Xfinity Series in 2002. He continued his winning ways there, earning 4 victories over 2 seasons, finishing in the top 10 in points both times. In 2004, Riggs signed with MB2 Motorsports, who had a technical alliance with powerhouse team Hendrick Motorsports, so he would have great cars and great motors in year 1. Yes, the engines were fast, and the cars were good. The results were not. Scott had just 2 top 10s and failed to qualify for 1 race. He finished 29th in points and had an average finish of 25th. In 2005, he returned to the team and improved to 4 top 10s and actually qualified for every race. But he finished 34th in points and had an average finish of 27th. In 2006, he moved to Evernham Motorsports, bringing his number and sponsor with him. He actually had a decent year. He failed to qualify for the Daytona 500, but persevered to finish 20th in points on the strength of 8 top 10s. In 2007, Scott remembered that his name was Scott and had a terrible year. He had just 1 top 10, his team fell out of the top 35 in owner points, and he began to DNQ for several races before finally being fired by the team before the end of the year. He went to Haas CNC Racing in 2008 and had another bad year with 1 top 10, and then spent the final 5 seasons of his career driving for several subpar teams before retiring. So let's add Scott Riggs' stats to the Scott stat tally, and we're now at 359 races and 25 top 10s. It's getting worse and worse with each Scott we add, but don't worry, you clicked on this because you enjoy the misery of others, and the misery is far from over. Enter Scott Speed. Scott Speed grew up racing karts and quickly catapulted up through the European open-wheel formulas. In 2003, he won the Red Bull Driver Search program and became a driver for the team. He was moved up to Formula One as a test driver in 2005, and in 2006 he was placed with Red Bull's B team, Toro Rosso. This was a big deal. Speed was the first American since Michael Andretti in 1993 to race in Formula One. After 1.5 lackluster years and several avoidable crashes, Speed was sent packing by Toro Rosso team principal Franz Tost, who was just kinda tired of dealing with him. Red Bull then decided he'd be a perfect fit for their NASCAR program. Despite having 0 stock car experience, Speed ran a full ARCA season in 2008, winning 4 times. He was a shoo-in for the title before fellow championship contender Ricky Stenhouse Jr. wrecked him intentionally in the final race of the season, which actually ended up handing a successful NASCAR career to Justin Allgaier. Speed also won a truck race at Dover in 2008 and looked to be the next great star. He was not. Speed was fast-tracked to Cup, making a few starts in 2008 before a full campaign in 2009. He'd earned just 1 top 10 in his rookie season and even had to drive Joe Nemechek's car twice because he failed to qualify in his top-of-the-line Red Bull Toyota. But Joe Nemechek was able to put his start and park car in the field. He finished the season 35th in points. In 2010, he had another bad year with just 2 top 10s and a 30th place points finish. For the second time in his career, a Red Bull-owned team showed him the door. Speed spent 3 more years driving for backmarker teams before focusing on a rally racing career where he's been quite successful. He ended his Cup career with 118 Cup starts and 4 top 10 finishes, 3 of which came at restrictor plate tracks. And if Twitter has taught us anything, restrictor plate finishes don't count because it's basically like a crapshoot, draw, and anyone can win the race, like even you could win if you had a good car. Restrictor plate races aren't real races. So adding Speed's stats to the overall Scott stat tally, we arrive at 477 races and 29 top 10s. That's sad, right? what if we made it even sadder? What if we removed the top 10s that Scott Pruett got while serving as a road course specialist in the 2000s? That's a fair thing to do, right? He's a road racing champion in multiple series, so naturally we'd expect him to do well on road courses. That would leave us with 24 top 10s in 465 races. That is one top 10 every 19 races. Folks, that is just under 2 top 10s per season. If we average out their finishes in the final standings during complete seasons, Scott's average a 32nd place finish in points. Abysmal. How is it that this group of drivers can have a combined 16 wins and 118 top 10s in trucks and Xfinity, have 29 total top 10s in 477 Cup races? Were their teams bad? Pruett's team was new, so maybe. Wimmer's teams were not the greatest. Riggs had equipment good enough to win for 4 straight seasons. Scott Speed was on a newer team, but his teammate won a race and made the chase in 2009. I'm sure there were a lot of factors at play here, but there is one constant. They were all named Scott, and they were all bad. But kids, don't worry. You can still be a great race car driver if your name is Scott. You just have to go to IndyCar. Scott Sharp, Scott Goodyear, Scott Dixon, they all have multiple race wins. Hell, Scott Dixon has 5 championships, and even Scott Pruett won an IndyCar before coming to NASCAR. Scott Speed made it to F1. So if your name is Scott, just go to an open wheel series, but stay the hell away from NASCAR, because no driver named Scott has ever won a Cup race, and they probably never will.